Welcome everyone to the fourth class on the 5 invitations. Hello, welcome, Genku. The fourth out of 5 weeks of our discussion of the book, The 5 Invitations, looking at death and what it teaches us about living fully and how we, as practitioners, can approach that, can begin to really take it in. Is everybody hearing me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Great, so just to say, so fourth week, we're on the 4th invitation, and that's starting at page 181, finding a place of rest in the middle of things. And what I would like to do this week, I think it worked well last week, that we had identified 2 topics toward the beginning of the discussion that we'd talk about. So for this week, we have any number of themes. So I will just mention them, list them, the themes that I found in the reading, and then mention the 2 that I'd like us to explore tonight, and then, or this afternoon, or more in the middle of the night for Michaela there. And then if there are other things that feel very pressing, then please feel free to just pipe up and we can go in that direction. But the themes that I observed in the reading this week were breath as an anchor, breath as life. That's one theme. School shooters, intimacy, working with the 3 poisons, or what are called sometimes in the Theravada the 3 defilements: greed, hatred, and delusion, or lust, hatred, and delusion. Remembering the teachings at the appropriate moment, so perhaps something to do with sati, with mindfulness, also related to the breathing potentially. Grief and spiritual bypassing, also mentioned. And moving from the busyness of content to the quiet of background. So these are some of the themes that Frank presented in the reading for this week. And what I'd like us to do, unless that, again, there's something very pressing coming up, which I'm really open to, what I would like us to do is to talk about Satipatthana, which was the reading, the optional reading for last week, and specifically that mindfulness and starting with mindfulness of breath, mindfulness of body, as it relates to this reading for this week, and actually the past couple of weeks. That's why it was assigned last week. And then also move on a little bit to spiritual bypassing, because I think that's probably one of the juiciest topics and one of the ones that can be really fruitful to explore. So, anything else that we want to talk about? Anything top of mind from the reading this week?
Trust was a big element, I think, when it fear and how fear and trust, that would be helpful.
Okay, great. Fear and trust, wonderful. Okay, we can weave that in, I hope.
If not, it's okay.
Yeah, I think we'll make time for it. Lovely. So the what I'm going to do is share my screen a bit and bring up this sutta, the Satipatthana, and it's a little tricky with the tabs there. Okay, so this is the link that was on for week 3. And I'm getting a little message that my internet connection is unstable, so don't hesitate to stop me if you're having trouble hearing me. But just to say, Satipatthana means Bhante Sujato translates it as mindfulness meditation. A more common translation would be the foundations of mindfulness, or the 4 foundations of mindfulness is the most typical translation that's offered. Sati, which we translate as mindfulness, and Patana, which is a shortening of Upatana. And Upatana means literally, is a Pali word, so we're talking about the Pali words here. The Upatana means literally to place near, to put something close by. And in this case, it means to put our attention right in the moment, a heightened form of attention that allows us to be fully present with what is, absent any kind of judgment about it or clinging to it, but just presence with it. And the first, and so you'll see that it has these links at the top to skip to various parts because it's one of the longer suttas. But there are these 4 aspects of, or you could say these 4 objects that one can be mindful of. Interestingly, there's a discourse by the Buddha in which he talks about the 7 factors of mindfulness. That's a different sutta, but just to say, in that 7 factors, there's one 7-factor sutta that says, well, there are these factors that are good for energizing you, and there are these factors that are good for calming you down, but mindfulness is good all the time. That's how the Buddha ends that sutta. Mindfulness is good all the time. In the Zen tradition, the way we typically hear, absent the word mindfulness, and just using talk about being in the present moment. Just being in the present moment. So the first of the 4 foundations of mindfulness is this observing the body. And so let's go to that link and skip by a little bit of the preliminaries here. So, and it begins with not to be missed, finding some kind of a quiet place and tuning in, sitting down, cross-legged, and so on. This is not to be taken as absolute. People can sit in a chair rather than cross-legged and so on, but rather talking about finding a physical posture that will help you to begin this exploration is very helpful. And then just mindful, they breathe in, just mindful, they breathe out. And this goes directly, I believe, to what Frank is saying here about the breath as an anchor, and using that in order to begin to find our awareness of patterns of mind. So there are different practices that the Buddha gives us here in the Satipatthana about mindfulness of body. He gives a whole series of them. The 4 elements is one of them, which we may or may not get to before the end of this discussion group. Posture, standing, walking, lying down, moving the body in different ways, the activities, extending the arm, and so on. Anatomical parts of the body, and a corpse and decay, thinking about specifically how the physical process of the natural process of the body returning to nature after death, whether it's the body of an animal or the body of a human being. But in particular, he describes people. He's talking about going to the charnel grounds and having a look at the bones and the different parts of the process. So ways of really, and these are said to be, the corpse meditation in particular is said to bring samvega, said to bring a sort of a spiritual urgency. When you realize the reality of that, the inevitability of that for each of us, that realization brings with it a kind of appreciation of how fleeting life is, and the need to actually use it well. So then, having done practice the mindfulness of body, and that again, typically the way that it's taught is that one doesn't necessarily need to go through every single one of those forms of mindfulness of body, but rather that one would practice one or two of those and then move on to the next aspect, if you're practicing Satipatthana over a period of time. And then you have, oh gosh, this is the posture still. Okay, hold on, we'll back up here. Then you begin to observe the feeling tone. So you're into the mental aspect, feeling tone, pleasant. Sujato translates that as painful, or typically I would say unpleasant is perhaps, in my mind, a little bit more accurate. And then, although it's dukkha meaning, that word that we also use for suffering or unsatisfactoriness. And then neutral. So those are the three kinds of overall feeling tones that we find in the mind. And then there is the ability to look at the mind itself, and looking at the mind in terms of these three poisons that Frank refers to in the chapter, looking at the mind and knowing. It's when a practitioner, he says, a mendicant here, knows a mind with greed as a mind with greed, and a mind without greed as a mind without greed. So just a clear knowing, observing both internally and externally. This is what the so-called refrain, or the phrases that are after each one of these different kinds of things. It's done for all of the different kinds of meditation, internally and externally. And observing the mind as liable, or the body, as liable to originate, to arise, liable to vanish, to dissolve, and to both originate and vanish. Or just knowing that the thing exists, that it is present to the extent necessary for knowledge and mindfulness. So these are the kinds of ways that we can begin to know the mind. And the tie-in that I'd like to make here before I stop and we can have some more questions, comments, and discussion about it, is talking about, Frank's talking about beginning to observe these patterns, the way that our stories are involving us in one way or another, you could say more suffering, more misunderstanding, more delusion about what's going on, more resistance to the naturalness of death. And what I find interesting is that, like on page 188, 89, he starts to speak about, if we drop below the surface of our minds, we encounter a vast serene calmness. Mm-hmm. And so that's one way of talking about it, as thoughts and feelings and concepts, dhammas being the fourth foundation. So dhammas would be things like the 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of awakening. Those are the two primary, understood to be kind of the two that are most often practiced, but there are other dhamma lists in the dhammas. And so there was one way to think about it, is like that, is like the surface of the mind. Those are thoughts, concepts, feelings, all of those things are happening at a kind of surface view, and there's a way to get underneath that. But a metaphor that I prefer, particularly when talking about the process of death and becoming more mindful of the tiny, tiny deaths of each moment is the background and foreground. So thinking about so becoming aware of the experience of thoughts and feelings and views and volition and the sense of self, all of these various kinds of mental experience as the foreground, the stuff that tends to be in front for us. And like you would perhaps like a piece of art or a photo of outer space, you can begin to become more aware of the background. Whether that background is the blackness of space or whether that background is a white piece of paper or a white screen, something on it, right? You can, that is one metaphor or one way of thinking about practicing the view of discrimination such that you can begin to see the stillness that is already present. Not below, but right in the midst of all that. So I want to stop here and just open it up for some comments and questions and see if this is making sense. If there's a more specific way of tying it into the reading, that would be helpful.
Personally, love the analogy of the stillness of the water, because I used to whitewater kayak, and when you're on the surface and you were in turbulent like rapids, it could be really scary, and you're just fighting to keep your craft upright. And then when you lost control and you flipped under, it was just instantly peaceful and quiet and still. It was just unbelievable.
Of course, you couldn't breathe.
But yeah, that's doesn't last long, but okay. Yeah,
well, I just remember hanging there upside down and just so enjoying it before I had to struggle to get out of my boat and get to shore.
There you
How
go.
great that you could pause and appreciate it. That's
beautiful. Yeah. So I think Sangamita, you're referring to, Frank uses the metaphor of the ocean, right? And he talks about sitting on the bottom of the ocean, right? And seeing the fish moving around, the thoughts as being like the fish moving around when really the rest of the water is very still. Yeah, nice.
Well, I think I was just, the first time it happened, I was just so shocked at the, because I thought it would be just as turbulent underneath as on the surface, and it is.
So the contrast really struck you.
Yeah, so it was the contrast that was really unbelievable.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yes, Michaela.
Yeah, it was lovely to see this metaphor. Every time I see another ocean metaphor, I think it must be the last one because there is so many of them. Well, anyway, I wasn't going to say this. I had a question actually related to mindfulness. It was, what's the relationship of shikantaza, mindfulness, and three poisons? Yeah, can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I got to the part of relationship of mindfulness, shikantaza, and the three poisons.
And three poisons. Yeah.
And then you said something more, but I missed that part.
Oh, that wasn't important.
Okay. All right. Well, okay, so shikantaza, as traditionally defined, is a kind of meditation on the kind of wide open stream of awareness. Right? So allowing whatever it is, whatever is happening in terms of the perceptual field, and opening that up as much as possible, and just being present with things as they come into the field of awareness, whether it's mental field or physical, whether it's whatever it is, in the order that they come, without any sort of attempt to categorize it or manage it or lean toward one thing or another. Just as Hozan Alan Sanaki, who's the vice abbot at Berkeley Zen Center, likes to say, he says, concentrate on everything. That's shikantaza. So that is, so you have to ask yourself, when you're sitting shikantaza, if you are in the present moment, right? If you're actually experiencing what's happening in the present moment, then is that mindfulness? It should be, it could be mindfulness, right? You're aware, there's an awareness
Could be.
what's happening in the present. It could be. It depends on whether there's clinging there or it's just a, you know, clear, unbiased, unjudgmental acknowledgement, so to speak, with enough attention that you're aware. So one way of thinking about it is like, if you're sitting and there's the sound of a car, and you notice that there is the sound of a car, right? Then you've been aware enough to notice that it was happening, right? Not that it was just some kind of phenomena, that the sound happened and you were engaged in something else. You were dreaming about Tahiti and therefore you didn't notice the sound of it. Okay. So that would be lack of mindfulness. But that is part of what happens in the cushion, right? Is that you're there dreaming about Tahiti and not actually being present with what's happening. So, and that's can be part of shikantaza, right? That you're aware of yourself dreaming about Tahiti or not. So you see what I'm saying? So there's a very fine line there about whether mindfulness is happening or not happening in those situations. Like not being aware that you're dreaming about Tahiti and you're just kind of all caught up, okay, fine. But if you're sitting there planning a vacation and you know that you're planning a vacation, well then, yeah, okay. So you're mindful of that mind object. So in terms of the three poisons, the same thing. So you can observe what's going on in the mind and you can see what's happening, or you can be completely caught up in that thing, right? You can be totally, you know, filled with rage, so much so that you can't even really look at it, or with grief, right? You're just completely, the feeling is of like being completely overwhelmed, like the wave is over your head, completely over your head, right? So it's very, very difficult to be mindful in that situation. But if you have a kind of greed that you can actually look at, or if you notice the overwhelmed feeling, and then you can start to sort of step back and observe that overwhelmed feeling, then you're less overwhelmed. I think Frank used the example of anger in the book. He used a beautiful example of this. If you're angry, then you're angry. But if you become aware of your anger and become able to observe your anger and investigate, the second factor of awakening, investigate the anger, then there's an aspect of mind that isn't angry in that moment. There's an aspect of mind that is actually able to be present with that. That is the aspect of mindful investigation.
And so far, we're just talking about one half of the definition of mindfulness, which is awareness. The other half is memory, remembering what are the instructions or what it is that you're doing. So to me, that involves the remembering the four efforts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is a distinction. So that's a very Theravada view, and yeah. So the 4 efforts are encouraging wholesome states to arise, encouraging wholesome states to remain, to be sustained, and discouraging unwholesome states and from arising, and helping unwholesome states that have arisen to dissipate. Usually said in the other order, starting with the unwholesome and then encouraging the wholesome. Yeah. Yeah, and so, which is very different type of meditation perspective than shikantaza. That's why I'm saying that, Sangamita. Because shikantaza is a totally non-interventional way of sitting. For that reason, it's often said not to be meditation, actually.
I'm not familiar. I mean, I'm aware of that kind of meditation, but I've never heard of that word you're using.
Yeah.
Shikantaza. It's Japanese.
Oh, okay.
I think.
Just sit.
I think.
Yeah.
Just sitting.
And that, oh wait, I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear
I can
you.
hear you.
Getting a weird echo because I'm in a big room. That's one of the kind of puzzlers for me, because I think I get a little confused about some of the terminology because we hear the word mindfulness so much. And in what little I understand about sort of the Zen tradition and shikantaza, because that's kind of the world that I through which I came to understand Buddhism, what I understand about it, is that this business about what mind is a big puzzler. And one of the things that I sometimes have trouble with and I don't know trouble with, but wonder about is what's mind and what's thought, and are we talking about the same thing when we're talking about thinking? Because part of the way that when you do shikantaza sitting, when you just sit, you're enjoined or encouraged to think about not thinking, and to sort of get rid of that discursive thought that says this is good, this is bad, and to just really be aware of what's around, including the good and the bad stuff and all the little monkey mind thing that goes on. You don't try and get rid of that. You just kind of, okay, notice that, back to the breath, sit, what's there. And this is the first time for me that I've seen the mindfulness meditation, the middle discourses that we're talking about here. So hearing a little bit more about how these two kind of perspectives can work together would be really helpful for me.
So for me, one of the important things, like there's this thing of effort. I mean, the 4 efforts are part of the Noble Eightfold Path. So they're part of what the Buddha taught us anyway, for the path. But the whole thing about effort, as far as what I understand, is sort of like this middle way, achieving this middle way where it's not horrible striving, because that gets in the way. It's not a doing nothing, but it's also not this really effortful thing. And so how I understand is when we're doing this investigation, like just being aware of what's arising, is that's when you can feel the hot coal in your hand. Like that's when you can see how the anger or whatever it is that's up, how it's creating suffering. And then when you're clear of that, then it's an instantaneous dropping. So then it's the second effort of letting go of the hindrance, but it's because you've seen the suffering that's involved with that state that has arisen.
Yes. And so I'll get back to Genku's comment and question in a second, but just to say, Sangamita, so, and ultimately all of those conditioned states have to be relinquished, whether wholesome or unwholesome.
Eventually, yes. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was trying to respond to your question there again, Genku. I'm sorry if I missed it, but that's what I was trying to do.
Oh, I see. Okay. I'm sorry, Sangamita, I wasn't clear on how that was a response to Genku's question. But yes, maybe I'm starting to see a little bit more now. but let me go back to the beginning of Genku's question, which is this question about mind versus thought, and say, you know, entire Buddhist schools, you know, over the millennia, many, like literally many Buddhist schools have developed on the basis of people trying to understand what is the meaning of mind, right? And how is mind defined and how does it work and so on. Ultimately, you know, the Buddha gave some very, at least as far as we can tell from the Pali Canon, which is not the only record of his teaching. I won't, you know, it's, in my view, it's not necessary to make that kind of sectarian distinction, but the kind of frameworks that he gave us were much more simple than many of the things we see later in terms of trying to explain, you know, even the Abhidhamma came later, as far as we can tell, from a scholastic view, from a scholarly view. So, but the simple test, I would say, about the distinction between mind and thought, Genku, is if you're not thinking, is mind still there? Surely mind is still there, right? There is an experience that we can have completely free of thought. In fact, the way we see it described in many of the teachings is there are all kinds of layers and of experience that we can have completely free of thought. So,
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Genku. I started to say something.
I wondered, maybe a way for me to get my head around that comes back to this idea of context and background. When you said that right away, I hadn't heard things framed up that way, and that is really interesting when you think about being in the thick of a moment with lots of people and lots of discomfort and lots of grieving or whatever it is that's going on. You, at the one hand, you can be engaged, and you kind of, when you are engaged in that, or even in any task like playing the piano or sitting at the potter's wheel or writing or whatever, you can get into that place where you're not thinking anymore. You're just in that moment of flowing with that thing. And it seems to me that gets into that notion about that's kind of real skillful means when you can do that, when you can, as Margaret said once, when you can get out of your own way, you know, and let that stuff happen. Maybe that's a little bit of that, a way around maybe not worrying so much about what's thought, what's mine. I mean, I don't know what the hell thought is. I have no idea. I have no thoughts about it. But maybe that's a helpful way to kind of think about that. It also leads to other questions about, you know, if you train as a social worker, they often tell you, you know, you got to engage with people, you got to match their level of concern and anger and so on. And knowing when to pull back and when it's necessary or helpful to find that kind of quiet space within all of that tumult. Or maybe just knowing that it's always there and you can access it when you need it. Maybe there's that kind of faith aspect to that.
Yes.
But I really need to think about that some more. I think that's a really beautiful idea. If I understand what you're talking about, finding something beyond the content or underneath it or in the background. Maybe there's other ways, like he talked about it in the ocean. There's probably even some non-ocean related metaphors. Michelle was talking about. Michaela, yes. Thank you. Yeah. So, yeah.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Genku, because I was thinking about that just today, that it also happens in chaplaincy training that we are taught that in order to meet a person, oftentimes what you need to do is actually come to a certain kind of strength of intensity that is similar to where they are, and that I found that that's sometimes true, and then again other times that's actually really detrimental. Like it's not that's not authentic or not actually helpful in terms of having the situation become more clear. But it is saying something about skillful means. So back, you know, as you said, in the midst of a situation where there's a lot of input, which when we're talking about being at the bedside of someone who's dying, or when we're talking about acknowledging our own situation, potential death or realization of impermanence, grief, all of those things, you know. Skillful means is or we would call it upekkha usually in Theravada in terms of equanimity, right? An ability to meet what is without a sense of getting entangled in it. Okay, Sangamita, sorry to make you wait there.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, if you experience the jhana states, is extremely clear in those states, the difference between the thinking mind and pure mind. I mean, because thoughts are absolutely gone, but there's an amazing, incredible awareness. And so, yeah, so mind does not disappear when thoughts go, for sure. You know, and so I think that's probably the best way to really get a clear view. They're saying it's like all the sensory and the jhanas, all the sensory awarenesses are gone, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, and thinking. And you only have the pure mind, and then that's when you can really get a taste of what pure mind is without the overlay of all the other sensory awarenesses.
Yes. And again, there are different layers of that experience, and that going into that, there can also be a sense of dropping the observer completely, like, you know, the way that it's sometimes talked about is like eliminating the sense of separation. And
yeah, you can,
and that again demonstrates something about what mind is, independent of this idea of self having a mind and self having thoughts and like that. Yeah. Mark,
yeah, I mean, I've certainly been in a state where there's zero sense of a self. Just this incredible awareness.
Yes,
Zero
me too.
sense of self. Yeah,
me too. And I don't think you have to even have that state in order to understand what I'm saying and what I think Frank is saying about stillness in the midst of thought and activity and general life going on. You know, but that's one way, certainly, and I think it gives you another sense of a different, perhaps a deeper kind of stillness. Mark, did you want to say something?
Yeah, a few thoughts arose during the conversation, and one is I think I would go as far as to say that thought and mind are two pretty distinctly different things. And I would say thought very much gets in the way of mind often. If you're in a circumstance where you're trying to reach out and connect with someone, and I'm sure we've all had it, where someone's talking to us and we're thinking about what we're going to say next, and then we realize we really haven't even heard what this person had said. If the thinking drops off, I think the connection gets vastly deeper with people and with life. The other thing I wanted to throw in while I was thinking of it is it was interesting the occupying the bottom of the water opposed to the top of the water. And I heard a Zen talk in a very Soto place. I presume maybe even Dogen was the source of it, but that a translation of a Soto work, you often hear in maybe more modern terms, maybe it's ancient terms, but you want to settle your mind, and the water metaphor is there so as to say to where you get a perfectly still or not a ripple in the pool sort of thing. And it was pointed out that wasn't at all what was being said. What was being said was that you walk the bottom of the water. All this turbulence is still going on, still there. You're just going to a place where that turbulence isn't affecting you so much. You're removing yourself from it while still being part of it in a sense. So I thought that was an interesting context for the various discussions that we're going on.
Yes, and that's, I think, a key part of the reason why I was suggesting a slightly different metaphor, because I think that we need to be aware that all of that is happening at the same time. The stillness and the activity is happening at the same time. Thoughts can be seen as kind of like a secretion of the mind, like spit is to the mouth. It's not a big deal. It's just what happens. It's part of what the function is. But finding a way to be aware of that distinction and to move skillfully between mind and thought, or among mind and thought, and know how to work with those things, I think is a very important tool for us as practitioners. It really begins to make the mind more malleable and more flexible. And the other thing I want to add there to your comment, Mark, is to say, kind of traditionally, there are two main aspects of meditation practice, and one is shamatha, or stilling, calming, concentration falls in that category as well. And the other one is vipassana, or you could call it insight, as is often translated, or actually it revolves around the awareness of diversity and the sort of mechanics of how things move and interrelate with each other in the mind and in the world. So sometimes what you find is a teaching that very heavily emphasizes one over the other, but ultimately both things are necessary, I think, and definitely useful. So, but most of us gravitate toward one side of that equation or the other also.
With the distinction of thought and mind, your comment earlier about bringing yourself away from a point of entanglement, for example, and that strikes me as I wouldn't have the skillful means to do it. I think if I were actually mindfully relating to a person, I don't know how I could avoid that sympathetic grief or anxiety or fear or whatever they're sharing without just trying to think my way out of it.
I've certainly been in situations where I've had to physically leave the situation because it's just been so heavy, and the other person has been so sort of dominant and making me doubt myself or whatever, that I've had to get out of that energy field and be away from it for a little, for an hour or so, to sort of connect back in with myself and sort of feel grounded and to see more clearly the situation. Because sometimes if you're with people that are very forceful, it can be difficult until you just get the heck out of that energy sphere.
Yes, yeah, that's very, very true and helpful, I think. Yes, Sangamita. And I would, to the question of empathy, I guess for me, the point where I would consider it entanglement rather than engagement isn't so much the empathy. Maybe there is some sadness that arises in me by some sharing of somebody else's sadness. But it's more like, am I pushed and pulled so completely by that I'm not able to, stand in my own karmic field and respond, or be aware and be be skillful as best I can, or not, right? So for me, the entanglement isn't so much like that there might be a similar feeling that arises in me. That might be okay. I might be willing to take that on. But I do it as a choice. And in that case, then I don't consider it an entanglement. Maybe other folks feel like there's a different boundary there. But for me, I do it as a choice, then okay. Then that's an engagement with this person and a particular form of engagement that I'm involved with, versus where I'm just completely snowed, completely hooked, and there's no choice about it necessarily. I'm just caught up, deeply caught up in some kind of emotional story or push and pull relationship or some other kind of, you see what I'm saying? Not so willing response.
His invitation in this case is to find a place of rest. We have not used the word rest at all in this conversation. We talked about stillness and an awareness of the difference between turbulence and being in a quieter, more stable place. But he's inviting a place of rest, which I find very interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question for the group here. How do we find that place of rest in the midst of this very intense life of ours, or death of ours?
Or death.
I think just going back, Venerable, to just the last thing you were talking about, that I think those are two very different situations, as you were saying. And when you're in the one, which is the one with awareness, I experience that as a restful situation. When you're caught up, like the situation I was talking about, where I had to leave the situation, that was not restful. That was just that was very discombobulating. But in a situation where, there's that awareness, then to me, that is a very restful situation.
Yes. Yes.
But you moved to a situation of rest, did you not? When you left that very fraught situation.
Yes.
You sought, you were seeking rest.
I was,
yes.
I was definitely trying to get out of that. That turmoil. Yeah. And the same thing when my kayak flipped upside down.
Yes.
I didn't want to do anything because I was just so restful, just hanging there in this stillness. I just wanted to just hang there.
Until you needed to breathe.
Until I needed to breathe.
Yeah. Well, and I think that goes a little bit to the koan, the optional Dhamma talk that was shared with you this week, right? Which is this sense of really going through not only the grief and the willingness to acknowledge what's happening, but also this deeper sense of abiding in the not knowing, abiding in the fact that we are beings that are being, constantly under the influence of all manner of things, right? And how do we rest into that, if not by some kind of sense of trust in our ability to respond, either by leaving the room or by, offering the tissues or whatever it is that we find at hand.
Well, the next invitation is to not knowing. And to me, you can't get into that rest state without letting go of all the things you know that you should be doing, maybe. Just letting it go. And then truly responding to whatever is there with your own agenda gone.
I can't help but think of the verse of the Kesa, which is something that sometimes when I can't focus on my breathing and I'm trying to sit and feeling like I need to be quieter, I'll run that through my head without, I keep little aspects of it keep coming up. And one of the lines in there is, vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction. And that's always struck me as just like, wow, what's that about? And the other thing that relates to one of the last lines in that I guess it wasn't in the end of the chapter, but he says, and I found this really striking when he said it, because I thought, well, how could this be right? He says, here and now is the only place of rest. I mean, you may.
Where else could it be?
Yeah, right. Where else could it be? But I think there's a tendency, and I know, as a good stuck axle wheel, we have all of these little displacement activities to get away from that here and now all the time. And that opens up a real interesting sort of way to think about practice off the cushion, right? Things like procrastination, or do I or don't I do the tough stuff today?
Yeah.
I'd rather not. I want ice cream instead.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of the tough stuff, yeah, right? Sanghamita wants to know what you think the tough stuff is. But so maybe we'll give you a chance to answer that, Genku, and then we're going to shift quickly because we only have like 20 minutes left here to go to our second topic.
Yeah. What's the tough stuff for me? A lot of those hindrances sometimes get in the way. A lot of those hindrances can be tough when I'm not. Well, they're getting less tough because I really think, but yeah, big procrastinator too. Yeah, paperwork, grading, last minute stuff. Working on all that.
Hindrances.
I'm in love with my
universal.
Actually,
you're in love with your.
Yeah, I'm not alone. With that.
Yeah, it's true. Sensual desire. So he's talking about the 5 hindrances, right? Sensual desire, aversion, sloth, and torpor. These lovely ancient words that mean things like and stillness of mind, and restlessness, agitation, worry, remorse, regret. All of that in one big package, nicely. With a bow on it. and doubt, corrosive doubt, right? Doubt in one's own capacity to awaken, really, more than anything. So, but I do want us to talk a little bit about spiritual bypass. Spiritual bypassing. And I love that he mentions the gentleman that coined the term, because it's been attributed to any number of different people. John Wellwood on 209, he says, the psychologist who first turned, we often use the goal of awakening or liberation to rationalize premature transcendence, trying to rise above the raw and messy side of our humanness before we have fully faced and made peace with it. Yeah.
I wondered when I read that if this is what Maureen Stewart was talking about when some of the sexual improprieties began to be made more publicly known, that one might be spiritually mature but not emotionally mature, if there had been some spiritual bypassing here. If I don't know, but it was the first time I had heard the term spiritual bypassing.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that it is related, right? It is related in the sense of those folks not being willing, those folks experiencing sexual abuse in their sangha or sexual misbehavior in their sangha, and not being willing to fully be present with their own feeling about it, or even acknowledge that it's true, that it's that person that they, aspire to look up to, aspire to practice like, is actually, not that idealized person they thought they were.
I think Stuart was thinking more of the perpetrator.
The perpetrator having done a spiritual bypass. Oh yeah,
right.
Certainly, right, because they can't see themselves as someone who's doing harm to other people, right? So
right.
by failing to acknowledge themselves as someone who's doing harm, then they just continue doing harm. Truly. Yeah, good point, Margaret. Yes, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. Yeah, but it doesn't, I mean, spiritual bypassing can also be extremely subtle, right? It can be extremely subtle in our practice. Like if I'm just cool or if I'm just kind, or if I'm just profound, yeah, then everything will be okay. Then everything will be okay, you know, then it'll all work out in the end. But there are many, many stories. I mean, the good news is, I suppose, that if you persist in practice, at least this is my belief. Let me say this. I would check in with all of you what your thoughts are. But my belief is that if you really persist in your practice, that practice will show that to you eventually. That practice will not let you ignore those kinds of behaviors. Eventually they show up. They show
Your
up.
Sangha will not let you get away with it.
Yes, that too.
If your fellow Dharma practitioners, those of you right here in front of me on the screen, will call each other when it's fake.
Yeah, that's a very important part of Sangha, right? Practicing in community is having that kind of mirroring happen, that kind of calling people out. Which means you have to get found, right? You have to be known.
Got to show up.
You have
to be seen.
And you'll be seen whether you want to or not, really, if you are around. But you do have to be around.
It doesn't work not showing up for Dokusan.
Yeah. Dokusan is a private practice discussion. Yeah.
That didn't
Tried
work.
that. Yeah.
Didn't work.
Oh no, I've seen
Not
people
helpful.
get dragged off the seat to go to Dokusan with the teacher because they had been avoiding him for like 2 years.
Ooh, I didn't go that long.
Yeah.
Dokusan.
A Dokusan is a private practice interview with your teacher.
One-on-one.
Yeah, Doku means one. And san is something, well, I shouldn't say, because there are various different kinds of san, but the way that I've been told is that that particular san means like meeting, like a gathering of people or an encounter of people. It's usually one-on-one though, Doku. And not in the Theravada. So just to say, maybe Sangamita, your experience has been more group interviews. Is that right?
No, we get one-on-ones, but they're called one-on-ones.
Okay. All right. With Ajahn Sona?
Yes.
Ajahn Sona is the abbot of Birken Monastery and Retreat Center up there in Canada. Yeah, thoughts on spiritual bypassing? What else? Have you caught yourself doing that? Genku gets a little, yeah, maybe. All quiet, huh? All right.
Well, I remember reading his part about that, and he was striving so hard to be something or to do something. And my observation has been that when the instructor, the teacher, is pushing people to have some kind of breakthrough, that's when I see it happening, because it's bypassed or it's missed the transformations that happen just naturally when you just sit with nothing but your own thoughts and you begin to see what you do to yourself, or things come out of your past suddenly full blown. And I found myself in tears over something that had happened 30 years before. And I'm thinking, what is this? That has nothing to do with having some Kensho experience or some, I don't know, I can't think of the word right now. Some transformative is the best I can think of. Yeah. Not that these thoughts don't transform also, but that slow, steady process and rubbing up against your fellow Sangha members, that whole scene works. And you don't bypass things, because you're not trying to get from here way over there somewhere and flying over and skipping all that turbulence on the ground to mix my metaphors all over the place.
Yeah. Oh, but I'm appreciating that. I'm a little bit of what I'm hearing in your comment there is something also about the culture of a particular Sangha, you know. That
Yes.
if the culture of our Sangha is such that we can acknowledge the gap between our ideals or our aspiration or a particular teaching or anything really, and what's actually happening for us, and acknowledge that in a skillful way, then there's less likelihood of bypassing, because you'll be kind, you'll meet what's there and know that other people are willing to meet what's there. But if the culture is unable to do that, particularly at the top, but in general, you know, to acknowledge those gaps, then it becomes very difficult, you know. And there's all this kind of other behaviors that crop up to kind of accommodate that.
Well, that was a lead balloon.
Yeah, right.
Well,
Okay.
it brings up a lot of things at once, I think, and you know, I'm in a place where I don't have traditional Sangha around me, right? I mean, I lived in California. I was fairly close to a place where I could practice and went through that, and I'm a member of that community. But now I don't know, what is it? How many miles is it from South Carolina to Southern California?
3,200.
We got a lot of spiritual practitioners around here, but they tend to be in mega churches, which is a very different kind of a community. And one of the interesting things that I'm sort of working on is how do I, you know, I'm trying to get, I've said this for a while and I'm actually doing it now, is trying to get a sitting group started so I have some folks around I can sit with. And, you know, I've tried the long distance Dokusan stuff and that's just it. You need to be there. You need to have that community around you. That's such an important part of the practice for me. And I know that, I don't know how it is for other people, but having access to some kind of intentional community or a Sangha or a group of people is a really helpful thing. If you're really trying to work hard on this stuff, you need the support of other people. That's one of the reasons I'm here. It's like, thanks you guys. Because this is a good way to do that.
Yeah.
It isn't the third jewel for nothing.
Exactly. Yeah, no fooling.
Thank you, Genku, for being here. And Mark, I think you did the same, huh? You started a sitting group in your local area so that you had more of a sense of Sangha. Was that your primary motivation?
Yeah, we've got a group that's met nearly every week for 4 years now, so that's been very nice. We see a lot of different people come and go, and have a core group as well that knows one another pretty intimately. So it's been very good.
And Sanghamita also in your house, huh?
Yeah, 25 years.
Wow.
I started it so I'd have some place to send my patients, but of course the person who benefited the most was myself. I recognized that very early on, and yeah, it's been really, really wonderful.
And maybe this goes to the point of trust, which Vanessa wanted to talk about, huh? That one of the things we learn in community, particularly I think important in these contemporary times where folks can become extremely isolated. You know, there's some study that was done fairly recently about folks in, I think it was in North America. I'm not sure if it was just the US. I thought it was US and Canada. And they asked people, like, list 5 people you could call if you were in trouble. If you'd fallen down and broken your hip, or, you know, your car broke down or whatever, list 5 people you could call. And some huge number, like the majority of folks actually, could not list 5 people they would call. And a significant number like something in the 20 something percent, couldn't list one person they would call. So it's really interesting, and it's interesting isn't a good word for it. I think to me anyway, it's a little troubling how disconnected people can be in contemporary society. And so finding people that you are willing to build trust with is even just like can be hard to do. Where's the starting point, So Sangha can be a good place for that. Sangha can be a place of learning how to hang in there for a long time. Is that helpful, Vanessa? Anything else that you wanted to add about that or ask about that?
Yeah, I think there's trust on many different levels. We had a Sangha group here, a very small one, but then trust became an issue there. I didn't necessarily, certain individuals I didn't feel quite comfortable with in that context, that kind of intimacy of the sitting group. And so that's one level of trust, very practical level, or like the one you're talking about, practical level of who can you call if you're hurt. Or then there are other deeper levels of the mind of trusting my perceptions or not trusting when I shouldn't, maybe my thoughts. Yeah, trust, I grappling with it on a bunch of different levels. This author of this book is amazing, the way things he's been through and how he's able to trust after his abuse and all of that. And anyway, trust is just a major theme, I think, for me right now, and on the path too.
Yes. Well, and that's an important point that Frank makes, right? He talks about really only being able to develop trust by staying in intimacy, by being asked to help out people that he didn't want to help, actually, right? To just face directly the things that he found difficult to be close to, or the people that he found difficult to be close to. So certainly with the process of death, that has also been my experience, being willing to be there for it, to be present with it, even at the times when it was very scary or agitating or confusing. Eventually I felt that I could trust being in that situation and be able to respond somehow, if only by being quiet sometimes, but some kind of, again, kind of developing that inner compass around skillful means. And how do we do that?
Trusting even when we don't know what's going on, don't really know anything.
Yeah, that helplessness too, right? We talked about that in the previous, invitation, the third invitation. We talked about really, really being willing to be helpless human beings. I cannot stop you from dying. So then what? If we start from there, then what? Yeah. Yeah. All right, folks. Well, it has been a very rich conversation today, and we are pretty well at the end of our time. So we have one more week to go. And we'll talk about the 5th invitation in the same time, same place next week. And I just want to share that I'm going to be in retreat. I actually have a small ceremony that I need to do, but other than that, I will be in retreat from the 6th to the 16th. And so that means I'll be in retreat. We'll still have this conversation, but just so that you know that I won't be on the forum so much starting Wednesday night, because I won't be on the computer very much. All right. So if you need to reach me, there'll be an auto reply on my email of where you can write to if you have something urgent. But in short of that, I will be sitting more or less blissfully on my cushion for a few days. And we'll see y'all on Tuesday.
Some of us are jelly.
Be well.
I just have a question